Our next speaker is Jacob Aday. He is a graduate student in the experimental psychology program at Central Michigan University. Jacob is in his final year of his Ph.D. and intends to join a laboratory studying classic psychedelic drugs for his postdoctoral training. Within psychedelic science, Jake is primarily interested in delineating the prosocial effects of psychedelics, for example, increased connectedness, gratitude, nature-relatedness, etc., and studying how these prosocial effects may be beneficial for clinical populations. So with that, let's welcome Jacob to share his research.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. And great job, Ingmar, on your presentation. That was really interesting. Like was just mentioned, I have an interest in prosocial effects of psychedelics as well. However, today I'm going to be talking about something a little bit different. If I can get my screen to share here. So today I'm going to be talking about a paper that I wrote in collaboration with my advisors, Drs. Christopher DeVoli and Emily Blesch, here at Central Michigan. And the paper is titled Psychedelic Drugs in Virtual Reality, Parallels and Combined Applications. And so to begin, psychedelics in virtual reality are each used to disrupt the rigidity of sensory experience, as well as enhance outcomes with mental health treatments. So classic psychedelics include things like LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, and DMT or ayahuasca, as most of you are probably familiar with. And VR is defined as 3D interactive environments that users navigate via avatar. And the early discourse around virtual reality was very closely linked with psychedelic culture, mostly because of their shared capacity to alter mental experience in very dramatic ways. And many in the technological community found that connection to be kind of troublesome, and they were reluctant to embrace that connection. But within the psychedelic community, there's actually a lot of excitement about using VR as a way to introduce the general public to altered states. And so Timothy Leary in particular argued that cyberdelics, which is the fusion of psychedelic drugs with cyberculture, could be used to reprogram the mind and potentiate therapeutic benefits. And he even went so far as changing his popular catchphrase from turn on, tune in, drop out to turn on, boot up, and jack in. And he had the famous quote of PC is the LSD of the 1990s. And so when VR first came out, there was a lot of buzz about it and linking it with psychedelic culture, but that really has died down until recently. So the point of this presentation is to detail the parallels between psychedelics and VR states, talk about how they could be combined together potentially. And then we'll also discuss experimental considerations for future research in this area and talk about different limitations that are inherent to the field right now. So I'll begin by talking about the parallels between psychedelics and VR, the similarities. So one connection between psychedelics and VR regards their ability to alter perceptual experience, notably visual processing in particular. And DMT in particular is a potent hallucinogen for immersing individuals into unique and vivid mental landscapes. And visions are a characteristic effect of other classic psychedelics as well, but they take on increased salience in DMT reports. So at higher doses, DMT visions can, quote, completely replace ongoing mental experience and immerse individuals into what are subjectively described as alternate universes. And curiosity in exploring this visual phenomenology can be a strong motive for usage with DMT. Likewise, a signature feature of VR is to immerse individuals into new visual environments that transcend the limitations of their physical self. And this quality actually has recreational and therapeutic purposes and implications. So for example, visual attractiveness of virtual worlds has been shown to influence entertainment value, and virtual immersion into anxiety-provoking situations has been used in tandem with exposure therapy to enhance outcomes with anxiety disorders. So together, the research supports that immersion into new perceptual environments can be an important feature of both psychedelic and VR experiences. Another commonality between psychedelics and VR is their capacity to evoke awe in users. And this can also have important cognitive and therapeutic implications. So for example, awe has been linked with increased curiosity, better academic outcomes, as well as enhanced well-being. And when used with proper support and integration, psychedelic experiences have been described as incredibly awe-provoking and personally meaningful as well. So Peter Hendricks from the University of Alabama has really been adamant about the role of awe in facilitating therapeutic benefits of psychedelics. And he postulated that awe can promote unitive experiences as well as feelings of sacredness and gratitude with psychedelics. In a qualitative analysis looking at psilocybin therapy for smoking cessation, one study found that the psilocybin sessions left an enduring sense of awe, and that enduring sense of awe actually diminished the relative importance of smoking in their lives. So having this really powerful experience that they could look back on actually made smoking less important to them, and that was an important reason for them quitting. And in that study, many of these participants actually reported not having withdrawal effects or very many side effects from quitting smoking. And that was partially probably because it was just de-emphasized. It just wasn't as important to them and their self-concept anymore. So similarly, VR has emerged as a modern and accessible way of evoking awe. So one study found that awe-inducing VR environments were associated with an increased sense of vastness, presence, and positive affect. Other studies have found that aesthetic beauty, themes of social connection, and familiarity and personalization can increase the extent to which participants feel awe in VR environments. So together, psychedelics and VR's potential to elicit awe is illustrative of another commonality between the two. So researchers are also beginning to assess if individually psychedelics and VR can be incorporated into traditional mental health treatments to optimize therapeutic outcomes. So indeed, in 2018, psilocybin therapy was designated as a breakthrough therapy for treatment-resistant depression by the FDA. And in 2019, it received the same designation for major depressive disorder. And these regulatory changes have really emerged from preliminary evidence indicating that psychedelic-assisted therapy can be useful for treating individuals with depression, anxiety, OCD, end-of-life distress, and substance misuse when used in the proper setting and with proper preparation. And some of you may be familiar with, there's a ton of different mechanisms that have been theorized to lead to the benefits linked to psychedelics. I'll cover just some of the most common ones. So probably the most common mechanism that's been linked to psychedelics in literature is mystical experiences, which are marked by a profound sense of oneness and unity, as well as transcendence of time and space. And it's thought that individuals' existential narratives can be recalibrated during this time of transcendence. Other researchers have placed emphasis on psychological insight or epiphanies that people have while under the influence of the drugs. And they postulate that these insights and epiphanies can actually stick with people long after the acute drug effects have worn off and influence their behavior and change the way they think about themselves and the world more broadly. Ego dissolution is another mechanism that's been thought to lead to changes in psychedelics, especially prosocial changes. Others have talked about neurobiological changes, like changes in neurogenesis and neuroplasticity, as well as direct immunological mechanisms, but those are still fairly speculative at this point until we are able to do further research in that area with humans. And others have talked about changes in default mode network activity leading to changes, positive therapeutic changes with psychedelics. And so the default mode network is really heavily maintained in our sense of self, and changes in default mode network are also highly correlated with ego dissolution or a loss of sense of self. And so it's thought that those two ego dissolution and default mode network changes go together to some degree. There's starting to be some debate about whether how selective default mode network changes are with psychedelics. So they might also occur with other drugs as well. So that's an emerging discussion in the field. There's also risks and limitations that should be mentioned when we're talking about psychedelic therapy as well. So in terms of limitations, so far there's a lot of unstandardized dosages across the literature. We have a lot of homogeneous samples. So a lot of the participants in the trials so far have been middle-aged, generally well-educated, and disproportionately male a little bit, it seems like. So we need to test this paradigm with more diverse samples still before we can really generalize with certainty. And we also need larger sample sizes as well. And in addition, while psychedelics are non-toxic and generally have low abuse potential, the drugs aren't risk-free as they can lead to psychologically challenging experiences. So even with robust therapeutic support, like in this picture here with two therapists there by their side, up to a third of participants experience transient fear or panic during high dose sessions. And given the potential for these intense emotional reactions, individuals with predispositions towards psychotic reactions are generally excluded from current trials. And lastly, psychedelics alone don't induce serotonin syndrome. However, the combination of an SSRI with an MAOI, such as that found in ayahuasca, can cause severe serotonin syndrome. So because of that, individuals taking ayahuasca are advised to not take the substance if they're on SSRIs, or if they are on SSRIs, taper their use under the guidance of a medical professional at least a month before taking the drug. And VR has also been incorporated into therapy recently. And what's interesting, it's been used to treat a number of overlapping disorders as psychedelic treatment, including depression, anxiety, OCD, substance misuse, and palliative care. In palliative care, it's been incorporated by simulating travel experiences for housebound individuals. And VR has been argued to impart its therapeutic benefits by providing a vivid but benign setting to confront one's fears, as well as by promoting memory reconsolidation in a safe environment and through a safe perspective. And ratings of immersion and presence in virtual environments predict a number of positive outcomes with virtual reality. So that suggests that, that's really important because that suggests that transcending one's typical experience or perspective can be a critical mechanism underlying VR's therapeutic efficacy. And many psychiatric disorders can be characterized by rigid beliefs about oneself and getting stuck in maladaptive habits, narratives, or moods. And so therefore, psychedelics and VR's shared capacity to transiently alter perspective and disrupt rigid patterns of mental experience might be common mechanisms underlying their analogous and their transdiagnostic benefits. There's also risks associated with VR. These aren't as worrying as some of the risks with psychedelics, but there are still risks that should be mentioned, including nausea, dizziness, and seizures potentially. And this table here is comparing the effect sizes from incorporating either psychedelics or virtual reality into therapy. And really, I only put it into the paper because the reviewer asked for it originally, but it could still be nice because it shows, very generally, this is not a meta-analysis. We didn't do quantitative analyses with these statistics here, but it shows that incorporating psychedelics or VR into therapeutic treatments might improve their efficacy, especially in settings in which only small to moderate effect sizes are typically achieved. But further research is needed to identify if incorporating both psychedelics and VR into a single therapeutic regimen would yield additive effects, or if their slightly overlapping mechanisms will limit further improvement. So to inform that work, next I'm going to talk about potential applications of using psychedelics and VR together and theoretical considerations of using psychedelics and VR together. So in terms of combined applications, already a number of recreational users use psychedelics and VR together for recreational enhancement. And entire online communities have actually emerged dedicated to discussing psychedelics and VR together. So on Reddit, there's a subreddit dedicated to just psychedelics and VR, and it has over 7,000 members already. So there's a lot of people out there already thinking about using psychedelics and VR together, and actually a number of people are already doing it recreationally. And this subreddit here is called Rift into the Mind, if anybody's And members of these communities have reported feeling greater presence and immersion into virtual worlds while they're under the influence of psychedelic drugs. And users have combined psychedelics with both competitive games as well as open world VR, which is less linear and allows people to explore virtual worlds more freely. And while there hasn't been any scientific studies yet looking at combining psychedelics with VR, these naturalistic reports can be a really valuable springboard for further research. So Reddit and similar websites have been demonstrated as inexpensive sources for high quality data and as cultural forums that can facilitate research ideas. Combining psychedelics and VR could also have implications in therapeutic settings in a couple of different ways. So first off, it's possible that simulating psychedelic hallucinations in virtual reality, that might be a valuable method of preparing hallucinogen naive participants for the sensory distortions that they're going to experience while under the influence of the drugs. So you can better prepare them for what they're going to be going through. And to that end, Suzuki et al. 2017 developed VR technology that produces visual phenomenology described as qualitatively comparable to the effects of psychedelic drugs. And it's possible that this could be co-opted for preparing participants. And next, like I said, that paper came in 2017, and since then, a number of VR companies have kind of tried to jump on this idea and develop VR technology that can simulate the visual effects of psychedelics. So next, I'm just going to pull up a quick video from YouTube that depicts one of these companies' product and how people would, go through a simulated ayahuasca trip in virtual reality. And so I'll just play like 30 seconds of this here. All right. So while obviously you'll never be able to perfectly replicate psychedelic experiences with virtual reality, this could be one way of kind of preparing participants for what they're getting into, especially if they're not as familiar with psychedelic drugs or the psychedelic literature. Another way psychedelics and virtual reality could be combined in therapy is by using virtual reality to optimize the setting in psychedelic treatment sessions. And the setting is widely argued to be integral to the drug's benefits. So that is, psychedelics seem to be unique drugs in that the context they're taken in can dramatically alter their acute and long-term effects. So as psychedelic research progresses, potentially researchers can identify which settings are most effective for therapeutic benefits, and those could be simulated in virtual reality. In addition, a lot of people, when they're under the influence of psychedelics, report wanting to be in nature. And currently, clinical trials are conducted in secured hospitals or laboratories, which prevent people from being allowed to be outside in nature. And so VR could be a way of at least synthetically getting around that problem by simulating natural environments that participants could explore and immerse themselves into when they're under the influence of psychedelic drugs in a clinical setting. Another potential combined application that I don't talk about in the paper, just because I hadn't thought of it when the paper had come out, I thought about it afterwards, is that virtual reality could also be used to test the effects of novel environments with psychedelics. So for example, no one's ever taken psychedelics on the moon. However, you could simulate that in virtual reality and potentially induce the overview effect speculatively. So the overview effect is this feeling that astronauts get when viewing Earth from space, and it's this strong feeling of connection and often love just for mankind and for the Earth as a whole. And so it's potential that, if you simulated that type of experience in VR and also gave somebody a psychedelic, you could, really prime somebody to have an overview effect type of experience. So although this synthesis of the literature revealed a large number of connections and potential combined applications of psychedelics in VR, there's still additional ethical concerns, experimental limitations, and open questions that still need to be addressed. So first off, given the proverbial nature-technology dichotomy and divide, some in the psychedelic community might be resistant to incorporating artificial devices into psychedelic experiences, which have been described as primitive, noetic, and sacred. And so researchers should proceed respectfully and be attentive to cultural concerns when thinking about combining psychedelics with virtual reality. In addition, researchers should keep in mind that the perceptual changes are driven internally with psychedelics and externally with virtual reality. And while confounding or conflating internal and externally driven perceptual changes could be a benign and harmless experience for most people, it could conceivably pose risk for those with pre-existing psychotic conditions characterized by self-other and pre-existing internal-external distortions. Another consideration for future researchers is that they should use findings from psychedelic science to inform virtual reality research and vice versa. So for example, one finding in the psychedelic science area is that psychedelics can lead to changes in sense of self, at least partially through changes in default mode network activity. And to my knowledge, so far, there's been no studies looking to see if virtual reality also affects default mode network activity. But given their overlapping changes in sense of self, there's some reason to expect that perhaps virtual reality could influence default mode network connectivity and activity. And so it's questions like that can be kind of bounced back and forth between the fields to inform one another. So there's also important limitations that are important to keep in mind right now. So first, although some virtual reality technology can simulate some of the visual effects of psychedelic drugs, it's clear that further research and development is going to be needed to replicate the nuances of psychedelic experiences. So in particular, refining VR-induced synesthesia is an area of study that is growing. It could be coalesced with psychedelic research. Researchers should also decipher if these different parallels and applications change across different types of psychedelic drugs or different types of virtual environments. So are certain psychedelic drugs better suited to be combined with virtual reality than others? And are certain virtual environments more suited to be combined with psychedelics than others? Again, VR offers a really unique paradigm for testing the effects of environmental conditions on psychedelic experiences because researchers can systematically alter very precise parameters of the environment and replicate them exactly across different experiments. And again, given this critical role of setting, oops, sorry, cat's coming through. Given this critical role of setting in psychedelic experiences, being able to identify the prime settings that can facilitate therapeutic effects could be a really important area for future research. So to conclude, The findings here demonstrate numerous connections among psychedelic and VR states, as well as several combined uses. Some of these parallels and applications have dated back to the inception of VR, but they've received really limited scholarly attention in recent years, especially in relation to this boom in psychedelic research that we're seeing. So in terms of parallels, psychedelics and VR are both used to alter sensory experience. They both can be used to evoke awe, and they're both being used in combination with traditional mental health treatments to improve psychiatric conditions. In terms of combined applications, a number of recreational users are already using psychedelics and VR together for recreational enhancement and to experience greater immersion and presence in virtual worlds. In our paper, we argue that psychedelics and VR could also be combined to be useful in therapeutic settings. First, by potentially preparing individuals for the sensory distortions that they're going to experience in psychedelic states. And they could also be used in therapeutic settings by optimizing the setting. So altogether, it's apparent that the connections between psychedelics and VR have important implications for psychological research. And this is consistent with recent increased interest into the interactions among technology, psychopharmacology, and mental health. And so lastly, I'd just like to thank my co-authors and my co-advisors, Dr. Christopher DeVoli and Emily Blesch here at Central Michigan. I'd also like to say thanks to MAPS Canada for having me today. It's great to be included in this speaker series. There's been a lot of amazing speakers that you've already had, and definitely looking forward to attending more in the future. If you'd like to get in contact with me, I have my email listed here, as well as links to my ResearchGate and Twitter profiles. And if you'd like to read the paper, it's published in Therapeutic Advances in Psychopharmacology, and it's an open access paper. So everyone should be able to access it and read it if you're interested. Yeah, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Yeah, I'll put that paper into the email that I'll send out later tonight or tomorrow, and so you'll have a copy of it to read. Thank you, Jacob,
Awesome.
for your wonderful presentation. Actually, I have a couple of questions here. So Mark asked, I think this was referring to one of your earlier slides. It says, "What about Jaron Lanier? Was he on this too?" I'm not too sure what it's about, but I think it's something related to the internet stuff. I'm not sure if Mark can clarify a little bit.
Is it a name you said? Sorry.
Yeah, I'm not too sure myself. So
okay, no worries.
But we can move on to another one. Sarah asked, "Are you in touch with Sarah Hashkes with Radix Motion VR out in San Francisco? Apparently, they had a journal club regarding predictive processing and the Imperial College with psychedelic research."
Okay, gotcha. No, I haven't been in touch with her, and I'm not familiar with Jared either, so I definitely have to look into that. I know Robin Carhart Harris with a graduate student in Cambridge. I can't remember his name offhand. They published a conference paper on psychedelics and VR that kind of touches on some similar themes and topics. So definitely advise following up on that paper if anyone has interest.
Sounds awesome. We have Nick asking, "To your knowledge, has VR been researched or applied in relation to dementia or similarly Alzheimer's? The default mode network is pretty significant in those populations."
That's a good question. I would assume so, because I know they've incorporated into a lot of older populations, a lot of palliative care populations, but I'm not as familiar with the virtual reality research as I am with the psychedelic research, I'd say. So yeah, I can't say for sure. I would assume that somebody's been looking at that, but I don't know for certain.
Mm-hmm. We have a question here from Adam, who asks, "I know you mentioned optimizing settings in VR for psychedelics. He's seen some neuroscience research leveraging VR for targeting fear, for example. Do you see VR and psychedelics setting optimization moving in the direction towards targeting fear as well?"
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that could be a really, really interesting area of research, combining VR and psychedelics together in exposure therapy, which is essentially what I think this question's getting at. And so, like I mentioned, in terms of the recreational users, they've reported feeling greater immersion and presence in virtual environments while under the influence of psychedelics. So, if VR exposure therapy by itself isn't working for a client, maybe adding psychedelics to that regimen can make them more likely to be immersed in the experience and to have it feel more real. And other studies have shown that presence and immersion can predict therapeutic outcomes of VR. So I definitely would think that would be a really interesting area of research to combine.
Yeah, sounds like something that could be explored in the future. So we have Anne asking, do you think there is risk from restructuring how you perceive the world while within an artificial reality? Especially if one uses a high dose while in a VR program that maybe isn't necessarily a therapeutic dose, but just something really, really high.
Yeah, it's a good question. Something I hadn't really thought about too much. Yeah, I definitely could see that being a potential risk, especially since psychedelics have been shown to acutely increase suggestibility. So you become more open to thinking in new ways and to open to being influenced to think a certain way. So yeah, if you're being presented with these very unnatural virtual worlds in a psychedelic state, I could see that potentially distorting one's concept of reality after the fact. I think that more be a risk for individuals with psychotic predispositions, individuals with pre-existing, internal, external distortions.
Interesting. So Mark was following up with his explanation earlier. So Jaron Lanier was known as the father of VR. So there's a link in the text in the chat box if you are interested.
Awesome! Thank you.
Yeah, and last thing, this is a question for myself actually. I think you mentioned synesthesia at some point where VR can be used to help, I suppose, show them what that's like. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit more.
Yeah, so far, psychedelics are pretty well known for inducing synesthesia, and that's something that's just starting to be looked at with virtual reality, is trying to induce synesthetic experience using VR. So I could see that being another area where there's a lot of overlap between the two concepts, another parallel where these things are used in different ways, or in similar ways rather. So it'd be interesting to see if there are synergistic applications. So if giving somebody who is a synesthete or experiences synesthesia LSD, if they're more likely to experience synesthesia, or if they're have more intense experiences of synesthesia. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see where that goes, especially when it comes to combining that with VR as well. So far, I think that's something that, again, kind of like all of this, is just an emerging area of research right now.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking time to answer these questions, and thank both you and Ingmar for talking to us today. I think there was a lot of interesting topics that we can delve deeper into in the future.